So far, our content on academic writing has focused on presenting the idea that we're interested in testing, presenting a theoretical background for it by citing literature and developing an argument, and then outlining the methods that we used to collect data and then analyse them. In the last video, I focused on results, presenting those results, the results that we get from data collection and from analysis, as though we are a tour guide, showing our readers around this new town that is our paper. Well, to some extent, for many people, that's the easy stuff done. We've ticked off 3 of the 5 elements of the paper that we're perhaps writing, or at least in this case, the 3 of the 5 elements of the paper that you're reading from a conceptual point of view. The next part is the part that many people find particularly difficult. Like this checklist over here, the huge task you were supposed to have done and you've been putting off and putting off. A lot of people struggle with discussions. I'm one of them. But what I try to do when I'm working on a discussion is bear in mind that from the get-go, from writing an introduction, thinking through the theoretical framework, putting together the methods and thinking results, I'm always mindful of things that should be going into the discussion. For example, when I'm working through my theoretical concept at the start of the paper, I'm also mindful of key elements, bits of interpretation that might be useful when it comes to my data, when I have them. I'm always keeping a list of those things, sort of jotting down and maybe at the end of the manuscript I'm writing or in a separate file. Remember to consider this element when looking at my results, because these authors thought it was a particularly important thing, or rather, as I've been reading these people's paper, this interesting concept came to mind that, and I wonder whether that's true for my data. Perhaps while I've been writing my methods section, I've been thinking through, well, this is a particular approach that I use with my data, and it might have a particular effect on the outcome. That's something I might want to reflect on when I get to the discussion. The same is true for the results. The results have presented themselves to me, and I can't help but do it because it's my nature, and it is the nature of a researcher to be, when they're presented with something, to be curious as to why those results come about. And so throughout the process, I keep note of these ideas that I have had the entire time, so that when I get to the discussion, I'm not left thinking, well, now what? Because in effect, that is what the discussion is about. It's an overall synthesis of the paper, the overall synthesis of the results, where you bring together the main outcomes and you interpret those outcomes. And in doing so, you describe and talk through where the limitations or where the applications for those results might sit. So a discussion ties things together. It explains your results and it offers comparisons of your results relative to others in other papers or different results that you have within the same study, and tries to make sense of things in that context. But not only is it doing that, it also offers some evaluation of how reliable your results actually are. Not from the point of view of undermining your results, but explaining where the limits might be to your data. In particular, a key thing that your paper tries to do, that a discussion tries to do, is to highlight not only what was found, but what it really means in the bigger picture, what it means in the context of that research question that the authors arrived at using their theoretical framework. So here we come back to that theoretical framework again. Now we are talking about implications and limitations in the context of that framework. Of course, once you've done a piece of research for yourself, you'll understand that one certainty is true, that you'll be left with perhaps as many questions as you started with, or perhaps a whole new array of new questions that you didn't have in the first place. And those questions, those ideas around potential research futures need to be brought up as well. So if you want to perhaps have a recipe that you can use to build a discussion, consider these 5 things: the major findings and their implications, how the findings compare, are they similar, are they different? So comparisons and contrasts with the existing literature, and perhaps comparisons and contrasts with the results of your own study, if you conducted more than one test. There's this element of the limitations of the study without particularly undermining the study, and following on from that, future research. Now, many discussions include a conclusion as well. In many instances, a conclusion section is a separate part of a paper, but in just as many journals and papers, the conclusion is part of the discussion. Regardless, a discussion shouldn't leave the topic that is being discussed left open. There should be some kind of conclusive sort of statement, something that ties things up at the end. Now, one element here that is in the list that students often overdo is number 3. I'll come back to that a little bit later, but it is very common for students to overstate the limitations of a study. And in fact, in many cases, when students write, they seem to want to state those limitations up front or include them as a big list of limitations at the end. Yes, it's important to include limitations and caveats associated with a piece of work, but it shouldn't be a matter that those limitations or those caveats become perhaps the most clearly argued part of the paper. So how do discussions sort of basically unfold? So when results are presented, 3 things that we might like to do. We might like to explain the reason for a set of observations or a set of results, where we give reasons or influences and provide a context. So perhaps if we saw differences in selection of sites between different species, we might state the result that the selection of habitats facing north to northeast is related to thermoregulation in a species. And then we might say that there are influences, there are things that might influence that the study was conducted in autumn and winter, and that habitat selection for these animals was perhaps particular to that season, and it might change over time. Or perhaps these authors observed that it did. And then when we place it into context, that selection for an environment is dependent upon the functioning of the entire system. So we have a specific result that explains that perhaps in this paper where we saw that the study saw that wallabies were selecting north and northeast directions, and then demonstrated, or at least argued there, provided a reason that it was related to thermoregulation, and then put that into the context of bigger picture influences and a broad context. So a discussion aims to do these kind of things when it is dealing with the results that the paper has arrived at itself. Not only is it presenting the result, but it's explaining, providing reasons for it, and then putting it into context. Ideally, that context is consistent with the context offered by the theoretical framework itself. Of course, there are comparisons. How do your results or the results of the study compare to other studies in the literature? Again, the emphasis here is on literature that is relevant to the study that is being conducted and the study's theoretical framework. So perhaps we're thinking about trees on north and south facing aspects. So if we, for example, went out and saw patterning in species distribution on north and south facing aspects, we would say that perhaps the patterning that we saw is consistent with these studies. In this location, that location. Perhaps in contrast to others, we found something else. But we wouldn't just leave it at that. We wouldn't simply say it was the same here and it's different there. We might seek to again bring in context and explain why is it the same in some cases yet different in others. And last, we might seek to evaluate. So we've got explaining, comparing and evaluating our results. Now, particularly if we have results that offer limited evidence or very strong evidence, we might want to state whether there is strong or weak results, and if there are strong results, what evidence does that provide? So we not only present the results, but we offer an evaluation of how valuable they are and how they might be applied. You can see two examples here in which the results provide only limited evidence to support an idea, or they provide direct evidence. In this one here, associated with feral horses on habitat. So is there good evidence? Is there limited evidence? Is it unclear? Is it strong evidence? Is it direct evidence? Again, the context that is offered here is not arbitrary. The evidence is interpreted in the context of the theoretical framework. And that is exactly what you should be looking for when you critique the discussion of your paper. Do the authors offer a contextual statement in the context of their theoretical framework? They need to always be bringing you back to that to maintain the relevance of the discussion. Last, we might also look to infer. And this is in particular the case when we are looking to broaden or to take the results of our study and apply it to a much larger setting. Perhaps there's an ecological theory that is being tested, or in Shinrin-yoku, perhaps there is the theory of stress reduction or attention deficit restoration. Now, if that is the case, then the authors not only seek to state the results, but then put it into context of what it means in the bigger picture, perhaps for a specific ecosystem. Past that, in many instances, papers and authors seek to broaden their results, broaden their discussion by drawing from their results a direct implication and suggestion that, in light of our results, we suggest that this should or could be done. So, drawing out our results in our discussion and the relevance that those results have for the population, perhaps its management, perhaps treatment of a population of stressed people. Drawing that out offers population level inference. It's not just a matter of making a statement about how our results relate to the population, but how they might be applied to the population. Now, why the hamburger? Well, there is a general principle around writing discussions. If you find yourself writing one at some stage, general principle around writing a discussion as though we were making a hamburger. Of course, a hamburger has a hamburger bun on top and the bottom, has it so you can hold it in your hand. Then, if at least it's a meat-based one, perhaps it's a non-meat-based one with a big patty in the middle, maybe some kind of sauce or cheese on the top and other fillings. Now, if you're Australian in particular, or you're familiar with burgers made in Australia, you'll know that this layer just here has a layer of beetroot. Maybe if you're into burgers with gherkins on there, like pickles, you've got a layer of that too. Either way, there are layers here. Some layers are big, and that's the main body, if you like, of the hamburger, and some offer smaller key flavours in a smaller quantity. What you need to do is to, if you are writing a discussion, see your components in the discussion like a hamburger. There are the bits that hold it together, that you can start and end with that, holds the hamburger together, and then you have this main body. But you have these key flavour notes that come in associated with the addition of sauces or beetroot in particular. But those flavour notes don't dominate. They are smaller components of the overall picture, important in terms of giving the burger a full flavour, but they don't dominate. What does this have to do with a discussion? Well, consider this illustration of the discussion hamburger, in which we have an introductory paragraph and a conclusion as well. Both hold the discussion together. The introduction offers perhaps a reminder of what the research question or the gap was, or what the intent of the paper was, bounded by the theoretical framework. Perhaps a really brief restatement of that framework is particularly helpful. It sharpens the reader's focus on the question in particular. Of course, the conclusion at the end summarises everything and draws it together. Now, in between there, we have these key components, maybe the hamburger patty and the tomato and the salad components, all equally sharing that space where individual hypotheses or research questions or sub-questions are put forward, and that explanation, comparison, evaluation and inference happens through each stage. What about the beetroot? Well, the beetroot, or pickles, depending on your preference, that's definitely here. But of course, like those flavour notes in a hamburger, the limitations and the caveats represent a smaller portion of the burger overall than the main body. Why? Well, because at least in the case of pickles and beetroot, those things have very strong flavours, and to avoid them overpowering the hamburger, we only put in a relatively small amount. And that is true as well for limitations and caveats. To prevent the limitations and caveats overwhelming the reader's reading of your paper, you need to keep that component of the discussion within reasonable bounds. If your limitations and caveats takes up a large portion of your discussion, the reader is left with the message that, well, this paper is full of errors and there's absolutely no reason that I should be giving it my time of day, and there's no reason that it should be considered as something that is relevant to me nor the literature in general. It is common for students to overemphasise the limits and caveats components of papers. Why? Well, I guess because students often believe that the work that they do is of little quality or limited capacity. My experience has shown that that's not necessarily the case, and students need to be able to see the limits and caveations, yes, but place them into context of the kind of error and variability that we see just around us as a consequence of natural population level variability. So how do you get started? Remember the hamburger just then. The first paragraph is really aiming to give the reader a big picture, perhaps reminding them of what the paper is about, illustrating once again the research question and restating the irrelevance of the study as a whole. Perhaps it restates the main problem in question that the paper was attempting to address, and as I indicated earlier, maybe brings back into the frame in a very, very brief fashion the theoretical framework. It might be only one sentence or part thereof that reminds the reader of the key argument. It does so because the reader needs to be reminded. Remember, they're only reading your paper, or a paper like you're reading someone else's paper. You're not inside their mind. When you write a paper, of course, you're intimately familiar with every part of it, and you know exactly why it was all done and what it all means. The reader is coming to it cold and needs to be reminded of these elements. And then the paper, like the hamburger, is broken up, the discussion rather, is broken up into these individual components where results are discussed in order. What order? Well, the same order that they are presented in the results section. And they are presented in the results section in the same order in which they are presented in the method section. So there should be a logical, chronological structure within a discussion. Progressively, each set of results is discussed, and then perhaps an overarching synthesis of everything is presented at the end. Now, what about a conclusion then? What does that do? Well, bear in mind that a discussion aims to synthesize, draw broad messages together from the discussion, and might leave off at that. It might, however, include a discussion. Now, a discussion needs to, a conclusion. A conclusion always needs to be present, whether it's part of the discussion or whether it is a standalone section on its own. And what the conclusion aims to do is to provide a summarised set of statements that bring your insights back to the specific research question that was asked in the first place, and unambiguously recap on the main points in the context of that theoretical framework. When you read your paper, your Shinran-yoku paper, you need to be looking for that in the discussion and the conclusion. Does the conclusion bring together that theoretical framework together with the main results from the remainder of the paper? So the conclusion does that. It brings things together in that context, but from there it can also pose new questions and highlight new insights and offer perhaps a set of key, clear take-home messages for people to take away, the readers, the main messages that the author wants you to take away. Now, some things are completely out when it comes to a conclusion. A conclusion should not be a simple set of restatements about what was found. So it shouldn't be the results section version 2. It needs to be a far more integrated, interpretive piece of work. Something that leaps past the results that you presented and looks to the future, tries to see the bigger context. And of course, a conclusion section should never include new material, new references, new data, new results, new ideas. Should not introduce new concepts. They should be concepts, results that have been covered already, presented in the results section, ideas that have been fleshed out in the discussion, and then just synthesized, condensed, brought into the frame in a conclusion. So there should be no surprises when you get to the conclusion. So some things that a conclusion should do. There should be some kind of restatement of the major results and a revisitation of the research question and that theoretical framework that exists. Interpretation of the results should be there, and there should be a consistent logical argument that built from the outset of the paper and the introduction to this point it should all be leading to this clear final statement. No unexpected results, no new discussion points, but there should also be a clear, in the end, set of statements about what the relevance of the work is. So things that should not be in there. There shouldn't be repeated information. It shouldn't be a matter of just taking topic sentences out of a discussion and then putting it all into a conclusion. That is such a waste of time to read, and everybody hates it when it happens. It should be a new and vital piece of writing. So no simple reintroduction. Something to be particularly careful of is not to over-interpret results and conclude and messages in the conclusion section. Often students, and some writers in particular, like to really get up on their favourite hobby horse and really ram home whatever point they want to in their conclusion. I reviewed a paper a few years ago in which the authors, based upon a set of observations they made a clear, apparent argument that what their results meant that all forest logging at that stage needed to be concluded because of this very specific outcome in a very specific location. Now, while that might be true in a particular location, it is in no way representative of ecosystems across a much larger area, as right as they might have been. It was at the time a gross overstatement of their results. So we need to be careful about not over-interpreting, but also then not overly focusing too narrowly on arguing a point associated with our hypotheses. We need to see the context that our hypotheses sit in. Other things that it should do, for some reason that's not working anymore. Let's see, there we go. Conclusions. They do need to be careful about interpreting, about citing literature. A discussion should present arguments in the context of the research literature. A conclusion should be drawn from that. So in the discussion, we compare our results to existing literature. In the conclusion, we highlight that comparison, but don't seek to reference it. Our discussions, though, do not seek to write a full literature review about the general topic. If you find yourself doing that, well, perhaps that's an idea for a different paper. But if you also find yourself introducing all sorts of new ideas in the discussion, that might be a sign that the introduction is lacking in content. Discussions and conclusions absolutely need to acknowledge the limitations and the weaknesses associated with maybe the research design, the limitations associated with how the data can be interpreted. There shouldn't be things like limitations associated with the people who did it. So a paper should never be written by a student who says, well, because we're all students, the quality of our work is no good. That is never something that should appear in a paper. So papers, discussions and conclusions shouldn't make the limitations or weaknesses a feature, or the feature, if you like, of the discussion overall. But they should also not ignore the weaknesses that are present. There needs to be some middle ground in there. And this is something you need to look for in the papers that you have. Do the authors actually identify where that middle ground is? Do they state where the limits of the application of their data are? Or do they simply talk about how their data can be applied to everything? Do the authors illustrate that their data are unreliable, as opposed to illustrating that they can be applied in some circumstances? That's the middle ground that you need to look for. Now, the conclusion, of course, needs to provide that clear take-home key messaging for the reader and overall leave the reader with a sense of the contribution that that piece of research has made to the research overall. So, a discussion answers the research question. That's what it is attempting to do. Answers the research question in the context of the theoretical framework and the methods that were applied. All relevant results are highlighted and discussed. All of the answers, all of the research questions rather, need to be addressed. Any unexpected or new findings are definitely highlighted in the discussion and again in the conclusion. But all of those results need to be provided in the context of the existing literature. As you saw a few slides ago, we describe, we compare, we evaluate and we infer. But one thing that we aim to do always is acknowledge where the limits of the application of the study sit, without overstating the limitations of the people who did it. Acknowledging that yes, we are human researchers and we all do the best we can when we're undertaking a piece of work, but we're not perfect. And science, research, it's not easy, especially when we are chasing theoretical questions with experimental data. There are so many circumstances in which the theories we are aiming to test are rendered untestable by circumstances within the research setting. Does this mean we shouldn't publish or reflect on that research? No, of course not. But we need to acknowledge those weaknesses and limitations. The contribution we make to research, even when our work has its limitations, its failings, that contribution is still valuable, but it needs to be described in context of those limitations. As this cartoon indicates, that's science. That's the way it goes, and that's how we progressively move forward. Well, what do we do now? Well, now that we've covered discussions and conclusions, you have almost everything you need to conduct your review, your conceptual review of your papers. There's one more video to come focused on abstracts. But in the context of the material you've seen in this video, now it's time to have a look at your paper. Have a look at your discussion. Does your discussion in the paper that you're reading critically assess and evaluate the results in the context of the research framework that the authors posed in the introduction? Is that theoretical framework still flowing? And then in the conclusion, do they offer a reflection, a new perspective on their subject area, again, that is based upon, in this case rather, that builds upon the research framework?